Mid-20th century, the Divergence. The Fallout universe and our own universe share the same starting point, but somewhere after World War II, the two timelines diverged, hence the name of the event, the Divergence. Now, the exact moment when this happened was never really pointed out by the developers, but what we do have is evidence that suggests it occurred sometime after 1951, since landmarks that were built around that time in the real world, like Boston's Freedom Trail, exist in the Fallout world as well. So if it happened earlier, the landmark wouldn't have existed in both worlds. The most obvious difference is the technology. In the real world, the big post-war breakthrough was miniaturization. The transistor, invented in 1947, led to microchips, personal computers, and pretty much the entire digital world we live in now. That whole chain never happened in Fallout. Nuclear power took that spot instead, and it got applied to basically everything. By 2077, the world looked retro-futuristic. Cars ran on nuclear fusion engines, household robots were a thing, and computers were still enormous room-filling machines. Needless to say, the culture was also fundamentally different. In the real world, there are arguably two main events, among other things, that made America introspective: the Vietnam War and Watergate. These two events turned a generation distrustful of its own government. But none of that happened in Fallout, which meant the belief that American power was completely rational and always ethical carried on uninterrupted until 2077. 2052. The Resource Wars. The Divergence set the world on a path towards self-destruction, and by the middle of the 21st century, that path was called the Resource Wars. It started with oil. The world had built itself on petroleum, and it kept the modern civilization running, so when the global reserves started running out, the response wasn't innovation, it was aggression. The United States went first, quietly destabilizing Mexico through economic sanctions before sending in troops to seize its oil infrastructure. Then in April 2052, the European Commonwealth invaded the Middle East, refusing to pay inflating oil prices and opting for military force instead. 3 months later, the United Nations, already struggling to mediate a world that had stopped listening to them, finally collapsed entirely. What followed was 25 years of overlapping, escalating conflicts. The Middle East War devastated both sides and ended in 2060 only because the oil fields ran dry. There was literally nothing left to fight over. Europe fragmented into its own civil war. Meanwhile, China, whose economy ran almost entirely on fossil fuels, found itself on the brink of collapse. And so watching all of this, the United States quietly began preparing for what was coming. 2053, the New Plague. In the middle of everything else, a disease appeared. It spread through the United States in 2053 and became known as the New Plague, a highly contagious, socially transmitted virus that killed tens of thousands within the first year. This forced the government to declare a national quarantine, which is the first in American history, and closed off the country's borders. Nobody knew where it came from, but rumors spread that it was a biological weapon engineered by China. Now, the disease had pretty brutal symptoms: profuse sweating, unexplained contusions, swelling, and eventually fatal external hemorrhaging. With no end in sight, the government finally took action in 2055 and commissioned West Tech Research Facility to find a cure. And while they never did find a solution, they were able to produce the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, a program that was meant to create a broad biological countermeasure. This eventually evolved into the FEV. Now, the New Plague was never cured. It simply vanished after the bombs fell, leaving no trace in the post-war world and no explanation for where it went. 2066 to 2077, the Sino-American War. With the oil fields drying up and China's economy collapsing, it was only a matter of time before something broke open. And that's what happened in the winter of 2066 when China finally made its move, a full-scale military invasion of Alaska, led by General Jingwei and the People's Liberation Army, aimed at seizing the oil reserves and the pipeline running through it. It was a calculated gamble, and initially it worked. Chinese forces took control of Alaska's infrastructure before the Americans could mount a proper defense. The United States, scrambling for a counter, put enormous pressure on its military contractors to deliver something that could change the tide of battle. So in January 2067, the first suit of power armor, the T-45, was deployed to Alaska. Crude, limited, but devastating against Chinese tanks and infantry, it stabilized the front and stopped the advance from becoming a rout. But what followed was a decade of grinding, brutal warfare that consumed both nations. American troops fought on 3 fronts simultaneously: Alaska, mainland China after a counter-invasion launched in 2074, and Canada, which the US had effectively annexed by 2076 after Canadian resistance fighters attempted to sabotage the Alaskan pipeline. Now, for years, none of it was going decisively in America's favor until they upgraded their power armor program. The T-51 power armor, completed in 2076, finally gave the Americans the edge. With better protected troops able to push harder and hold more ground, they broke Chinese supply lines and cut off their ability to sustain the occupation. By 2077, after 10 years of war, American forces liberated Anchorage. General Jingwei, an important Chinese field commander, was killed in the fighting. Back home, however, the country was falling apart. Food shortages triggered riots. automation had displaced thousands of workers in Appalachia, who took to the streets only to be met with private security and National Guardsmen. Martial law was declared. The president quietly abandoned the White House and moved to a decommissioned oil rig off the coast of San Francisco with the inner circle that would become the Enclave. The war had been won in Alaska, but by October 2077, there was no clear path to winning it everywhere else, and everyone at the top seemed to know it. October 23, 2077. The Great War. This is the single biggest event that catalyzed the entire Fallout universe as we know it. In the early hours of October 23rd, the US Pacific Fleet detected unidentified submersible objects off the coast of California. A few hours later, a squadron of high-titulud bombers appeared near the Bering Strait, believed to be Chinese. Nobody pulled the trigger immediately, but the detection systems were already running. The military was already on alert, and somewhere in that window of tension, the first missiles launched. The moment NORAD confirmed what they were looking at, the president ordered a retaliatory strike. That decision, made in a matter of minutes, is what turned a bad morning into the end of the world. Warheads hit Pennsylvania and New York first, then Boston and Washington, D.C. minutes after. The exchange lasted roughly 2 hours. When it was over, both China and the United States were functionally gone, along with most of the world that had spent a decade watching them fight each other. One thing worth noting is that the warheads used were smaller kiloton-class weapons rather than the massive megaton bombs of older arsenals. That might sound like a restraint, but it wasn't. Smaller warheads sent more debris into the lower atmosphere, which meant the fallout spread faster and wider than larger bombs would have produced. The planet didn't just get hit, it got poisoned. Who fired first was never confirmed, and the series has always kept it that way deliberately. A relative few made it into the vaults in time. Most didn't, and the ones who did would eventually find out that surviving underground came with its own costs. 2077, the founding of the Brotherhood of Steel. 2 weeks before the Great War, on October 10th, the base's commanding officer suffered a breakdown after discovering that the West tech scientists under his protection had been secretly experimenting on military prisoners with the forced evolutionary virus. He then ended himself, leaving Captain Roger Maxson in charge of the investigation. Maxson interrogated the scientists, obtained confessions, and executed said scientists. Nobody knew it at that time, but it was the start of something the world had never seen before. 3 days before the bombs dropped, Maxson broadcast a declaration of secession from the United States over the radio, essentially trying to force the government to respond to what had happened at Mariposa. But nobody responded. That's because the government had bigger problems. When the bombs finally fell, Maxson's unit was kept safe in a base, and once the radiation outside was manageable, they took the opportunity to move. On October 27th, Maxson gathered his soldiers and their families, put the troops in T-51 power armor, and led them south toward a government bunker at Lost Hills. The march was brutal though, and because not all of them had power armor, many unprotected civilians were killed by marauders, including Maxson's own wife. Eventually, they reached Lost Hills and made it their home. But Maxson wasn't just looking for shelter, he was building something. Over the following years, he replaced the fractured identity of soldiers who no longer had a country to serve with new ranks, new traditions, and a clear sense of purpose. By 2082, the Brotherhood of Steel was born, and it had one goal: collect and preserve technology that the rest of the world is clearly incapable of handling. 2085 to 2103, the Scorched Plague Crisis. Before any of the major factions of the post-war world had a chance to fully establish themselves, Appalachia had a crisis that nearly destroyed it completely. It was called the Scorched Plague, and it was the result of the Appalachian Enclave's biochemical experiments on bats deep in the Cranberry Bog, beginning around 2083. The bats, already mutated by radiation, were accidentally exposed to biochemical agents that transformed them into what's known as scorch beasts that spread the infection through particulates shed by their wings. The disease worked fast. A victim's skin would darken and smell of ash. Burning lesions formed across the body, then split open, exposing muscle tissue and green ultracite crystals erupting from beneath the skin. Along with these physical changes came the erasure of the person, their mind absorbed into the scorch beast's hive mind, completely enthralled to the will of the queen. In humans, the final stage was petrification, a slow, statue-like death that left behind nothing but a radioactive, crystallized corpse. By 2086, the plague had engulfed much of Appalachia. Every major faction in the region, the Responders, the Free States, the Brotherhood's Appalachian chapter, the Raiders, scrambled to develop countermeasures, but distrust and political tension between them made cooperation nearly impossible. One by one, they were wiped out. By 2102, there was no human life left on the surface of core Appalachia. The only thing that saved the region was Vault 76. When its doors opened on October 23, 2102, exactly 25 years after the Great War, the Vault dwellers emerged into a dead wasteland and finished what the factions before them had started. They finalized a vaccine, launched nuclear strikes against the Scorch Beast Queen's Fisher site, and destroyed her. By 2103, the plague's hold on Appalachia was finally broken. 2097 to 2141, the founding of Shady Sands. Not every story from the post-war era is one of collapse. When Vault 15 opened around 2097, its inhabitants emerged into the California wasteland and promptly went in different directions. Some formed the raider clans that would plague the region for generations, the Khans, the Vipers, the Jackals, but the others, led by a man named Aradesh and his descendants, chose something different. They built a town. Shady Sands was officially established around 2141, a small, quiet farming community in the California desert, surrounded by threats it could barely contain. Red scorpions attacked regularly while raiders harassed the settlement edges, but the community held on strong and eventually slowly grew. What made Shady Sands different from the dozens of other desperate settlements struggling to survive in New California wasn't any particular military advantage. It was the fact that the people there seemed to actually believe in something. In community, in order, and in the idea that life after the bombs could mean more than just survival. 2110. The founding of the Institute. Beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology in Boston, a group of survivors made a unique choice. When the bombs fell, those inside the CIT took shelter underground. In the years that followed, their children and grandchildren, the second generation of survivors, dug deeper, built laboratories, and formalized what officially became known as the Institute in 2110. With a motto of mankind redefined, the organization's purpose was the advancement of human knowledge and specifically development of synthetic beings as the next frontier of scientific achievement. Over the following century and a half, they built technological advancements the post-war world could only dream of. Advanced laser weapons, teleportation, and eventually synthetic humans that were completely indistinguishable from the real thing. While most researchers and scientists are quick to present their inventions to the world, the Institute shared none of their breakthroughs with the surface world. Instead, it sealed itself off permanently after the molecular relay was completed and regarded the people living above them as, at best, a resource to be used and, at worst, an inconvenience to be removed. Settlements were wiped out for minor research purposes. People were abducted and replaced with synth copies. Super mutants produced from their FEV experiments were released into the Commonwealth as a proxy conflict in their favor. The Institute believed that the wasteland was a lost cause and that they were humanity's only real future. I mean, when you can literally create people out of thin air, you probably have a point. 2102 to 2162. The rise and fall of the Unity. A doctor named Richard Gray made a catastrophic mistake. He had joined an expedition to Mariposa military base to investigate increasing mutant attacks on caravans out of the hub. During a firefight inside the base, he was knocked into a vat of undiluted forced evolutionary virus. He floated there for days, nearly drowning, while the FEV rewrote everything he was. When he dragged himself out, he was no longer Richard Gray. The mutation had expanded his mind into something extraordinary, capable of connecting neurologically with computers, absorbing other minds into a growing hive consciousness, and eventually processing the most complex philosophical questions with perfect clarity. He became known as the Master. Over the following decades, the Master built his vision, the Unity, a super mutant army created by capturing humans, exposing them to FEV, and conscripting the survivors. He also created the Children of the Cathedral in 2152. It was the perfect front, a public-facing religious organization that allowed him to grow his forces in the shadows while the world looked the other way. With his influence spreading, he moved the entire operation to the Los Angeles Vault in 2155, officially establishing the cathedral right on top of it to anchor his power. His goal was a forced evolution of humanity. Replace human beings with super mutants, stronger, radiation-resistant, built for a post-nuclear world. What he didn't know, and what the Vault Dweller eventually proved to him, was that his super mutants were sterile. They couldn't reproduce. The Unity's endgame was not a new civilization. It was the end of the human species, replaced by a dead end. On March 3, 2162, the Vault Dweller infiltrated the cathedral and killed the Master. Less than 2 months later, the Mariposa military base was destroyed, collapsing the Unity entirely. The Brotherhood of Steel drove the remaining super mutants out of New California. And just like that, the threat was over. But the super mutants remained, scattered across the continent, shaping the wasteland for generations to come. 2186 to 2189, the founding of the NCR. By the mid-22nd century, Shady Sands had grown into something remarkable, and its leader, Aradesh, and later his daughter Tandi, had been watching the wasteland around them carefully enough to realize something: the individual settlements of New California were stronger together than they were apart. So in 2186, Aradesh formally proposed an idea that would change the landscape of the wasteland. And only 3 years later, in 2189, the new California Republic was voted into existence, a federation of 5 states built around the major settlements of the wasteland: Shady, Los Angeles, Hub, Maxon, and Dayglow. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most ambitious thing anyone had attempted in the post-war world. A democratic republic with elections, rule of law, a uniformed police force, and the explicit rejection of people being used as commodities. When Tandy took over as president in 2196 after her father's death, she shaped the NCR into a model of what post-apocalyptic civilization could actually look like: steady expansion, trade networks, and standards of living that approached what the pre-war world had offered. By 2241, the NCR had a population of over 700,000 citizens. It had a functional economy, a professional military, and the kind of institutional legitimacy that no other faction in the wasteland could match. It was imperfect, increasingly expansionist, and not without its contradictions. But for a very long time, it was the best argument anyone had that civilization could be rebuilt. 2242. The destruction of the Enclave Oil Rig. The Enclave had spent years positioning itself as the most powerful force in the post-war world, and by 2242, it was close to achieving something genuinely catastrophic. Operating from a fortified oil rig 175 miles off the coast of California, the organization, which presented itself as the legitimate continuation of the United States government, had developed a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus capable of killing everyone in the wasteland exposed to radiation, which, after 2 centuries of fallout, was essentially everyone. The plan was to release it into the oceanic jet streams and let nature do the rest, clearing the mainland for Enclave recolonization. To test and refine the weapon, they needed subjects: irradiated wastelanders as the contaminated sample, and untouched vault dwellers as the control group. They got both by raiding Arroyo and Vault 13, but what they didn't account for was the Chosen One, a tribal from Arroyo who made it to the rig on a decommissioned oil tanker. And while the odds were stacked against them, they would achieve something close to the impossible. Upon arriving, the Chosen One freed the captives, sabotaged the reactor, and most impressively killed the Enclave's second greatest weapon next to the virus, the brutal super mutant enforcer, Frank Horrigan. The Chosen One also sailed away with enough distance between them and the fireball to watch the whole rig get blown to smithereens. President Richardson died in the explosion, and the Enclave's senior command structure was shattered. Surviving Enclave members retreated east to their installation at Raven Rock in the capital wasteland, effectively abandoning New California. The NCR and Brotherhood of Steel spent the next several years hunting down everyone who stayed. The Enclave had come closer to ending the wasteland than any faction before or since, but thanks to the Chosen One, all of that failed. 2247. The rise of Caesar's Legion. One of the most brutal and powerful factions in the wasteland wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for one hostage situation. In 2246, the followers of the apocalypse sent a small group to the Grand Canyon to study tribal languages. Among them was Edward Sallow, an educated, intelligent man with an extensive knowledge of Roman history, and Joshua Graham, a Mormon missionary fluent in tribal dialects. Not long into the expedition, the group was captured by the Blackfoot tribe. The Blackfoots were at war with 7 neighboring tribes simultaneously and were naturally losing. Sallow assessed the situation and made a decision that was practical, ruthless, and ultimately world-shaping. He taught them how to fight properly: tactics, gun maintenance, explosives, small unit coordination, everything he'd absorbed from reading about Roman military doctrine. Under his guidance, the Blackfoots didn't just survive the war, they subjugated all 7 rival tribes. In doing so, Sallow realized he had found his true calling. He renamed himself Caesar, reorganized his followers along Roman military lines, and began building what he called the Legion, a force built on total war, absolute loyalty, and the wholesale absorption of every tribe it conquered. He had a simple formula: those who resisted were enslaved or killed. Individual tribal identities were erased. There was only the Legion. By 2277, Caesar's Legion had consumed 65 tribes and was expanding westward toward the Colorado River, toward Hoover Dam, and toward the NCR. Joshua Graham, now the Malpais legate, the Legion's greatest general, led the advance. Whatever Edward Sallow had been before 2246, he was Caesar now, and Caesar intended to march all the way to the Pacific. Late 2250s. The NCR Brotherhood War begins. For a time, the Brotherhood of Steel and the New California Republic had managed a working relationship. One of the NCR's 5 founding states was even named Maxon after the Brotherhood's founder. The organization maintained an outpost in Shady Sands. Things were, if not warm, functional. But the problem is, these 2 factions are like the scorpion and the frog. Eventually, their true natures were going to clash. As the NCR expanded and its population swelled past 700,000, the Brotherhood adopted an increasingly hostile posture towards anyone accessing or possessing advanced technology outside their control, particularly energy weapons, which they began confiscating from civilians and traders. Naturally, the NCR refused to accept this, which then destroyed the cordial relationship between the two. What followed was a long, grinding military conflict that bled both sides badly. In the early years, the Brotherhood's superior training and equipment gave them a decisive edge. They raided NCR gold reserves and drove the Republic into an economic crisis so severe it had to abandon the gold standard and switch to fiat currency, triggering inflation and a collapse of consumer confidence. But the Brotherhood faced a problem they couldn't solve. They were a closed order that didn't recruit replacements fast enough. The NCR could absorb losses. The Brotherhood couldn't. As the war dragged on, the numbers began to tell, and just like the fable, the scorpion that bit the frog drowned in the river. Brotherhood bunkers fell one by one. Some were destroyed by their own occupants, rather than surrendered. Morale deteriorated, some members deserted, and by the time the war wound down, the Brotherhood had been pushed out of New California and into hiding, a diminished, hunted version of the organization that had once been the Wasteland's preeminent military force. It was the first major defeat in Brotherhood history, and they never fully recovered on the West Coast. 2271, NCR Desert Rangers Unification. Before the new California Republic pushed east into Nevada, there was already someone fighting Caesar's Legion there, the Desert Rangers. The Desert Rangers were a loosely organized paramilitary group operating throughout Nevada, and they'd been clashing with the Legion long before the NCR knew it existed. By 2271, they were losing. The Legion had grown too large, too disciplined, and too well supplied for the Rangers to contain on their own. Something had to give, and so, at the Mojave Outpost, a former checkpoint on the old California-Nevada border, representatives of the Desert Rangers and the NCR Rangers sat down and signed the Ranger Unification Treaty. Under its terms, the Desert Rangers would be absorbed entirely into the NCR Rangers. In exchange, the NCR promised to protect and fight for Hoover Dam, New Vegas, and Southern Nevada against the Legion. It was a merger driven by necessity on both sides. The Desert Rangers got the manpower and institutional backing of the Republic behind them. The NCR got battle-tested fighters who knew the Mojave, knew the Legion, and had been surviving in Caesar's shadow long enough to understand exactly what they were facing. The monument erected at the Mojave Outpost to mark the occasion still stood years later, two massive figures cast in scrap metal. Commemorating the moment, a small, dying force chose to join something larger rather than be consumed. 2274. The awakening of Mr. House Robert House had anticipated the Great War by a whopping 15 years before it happened, and by April 2065, his mathematical projections had given him a precise certainty. Nuclear exchange was coming within 15 years. Everything he did from that point forward was preparation. He built the Lucky 38's defense network to intercept incoming warheads. He placed his body in a life support chamber, wiring his brain directly into his information systems. He made deals with Vault Tech for control over certain vaults. He stockpiled resources. And on October 23, 2077, when the missiles flew, his systems activated, redirecting or destroying all but 9 of the 77 warheads aimed at Las Vegas, preserving the city at the cost of an enormous strain on his body and network. The effort nearly killed him. He spent the next several decades in a coma, fighting system crashes and power failures from within the Lucky 38, while the ruins of Vegas were picked over by scavengers above him. He woke up in 2138, and he waited. House was patient. He needed to see signs of organized civilization before making his move. That signal came in 2274, when NCR scouts were detected approaching Hoover Dam. House activated his Securitrons and stepped back into the world, brokering a deal with 3 tribal groups who'd taken up residence in the Vegas ruins, reorganizing them into the 3 families, and using them to clear out rivals and rebuild the Strip. The result was the free economic zone of New Vegas, independent, profitable, and entirely under his control. He then negotiated directly with the NCR as an equal. The Republic got access to Hoover Dam and McCarran Airport. House got recognition of his sovereignty over New Vegas, and he was pretty much back. He just needed one more thing: the platinum chip, which had been lost in Sunnyvale since the bombs fell, and which he'd spent decades and millions of caps trying to recover. 2276. Operation Sunburst, NCR, victory at Helios 1. The Mojave Brotherhood of Steel had made a mistake, and they'd had 2 years to watch it slowly close around them. When the chapter established itself in the region, their elder, a scribe-turned-elder named Elijah, already considered unorthodox by his peers, ordered them to garrison Helios 1, a pre-war Poseidon energy solar plant. His fixation on unlocking the facility's secrets drove decision-making for the entire chapter, even at the expense of their actual mission. By 2274, when the NCR arrived at Hoover Dam and began pushing into the Mojave, the Brotherhood found themselves defending an exposed, indefensible position. His subordinates told him as much. Elijah didn't listen. In October 2276, the NCR launched Operation Sunburst, a concentrated assault on Helios 1 with a force outnumbering the Brotherhood's defenders by somewhere between 15 and 20 to 1. The Brotherhood held longer than it should have been possible, but when their ammunition finally ran out, then Paladin McNamara ordered a counter-push to break through NCR lines and retreat toward Hidden Valley. Elijah, somewhere in the facility, simply vanished, abandoning his chapter mid-battle like a coward. The Brotherhood lost more than half its Paladins and Knights in the retreat, while the NCR claimed the facility. What they didn't get was the control center. The Brotherhood had reactivated Helios 1's ancient Archimedes security system on the way out, killing 2 NCR soldiers who triggered it and sealing the controls off for years. In the aftermath of the fight, McNamara became elder of what was left. He ordered a full lockdown of Hidden Valley, and the Mojave Brotherhood, one of the most capable military forces in the region not long before, was now battered, sealed underground, and waiting for a situation that never quite improved enough to act on. 2277. The First Battle of Hoover Dam. By the mid-23rd century, two of the most powerful forces in the wasteland were on a collision course. The new California Republic had been expanding steadily eastward into Nevada, drawn by the promise of Hoover Dam, a functioning pre-war hydroelectric plant capable of powering entire cities. Control of the dam meant control of the region's energy supply, which made it one of the most strategically valuable pieces of infrastructure left in the wasteland. Caesar's legion had been watching. Under the command of the Malpais legate, the legion assaulted Hoover Dam in force. Their early push was effective. They drove NCR forces off the dam and into Boulder City, but NCR Rangers under Chief Hanlon had planned for this. The retreat into Boulder City was deliberate. The Rangers and 1st Recon had mined every route, and when the Legion's elite forces followed in pursuit, the explosives were detonated. This decimated the Legion's veteran units in a single moment. Immediately, the NCR counterattacked, which broke the Legion. Caesar, furious at the failure, had the Malpais legate doused in pitch, set on fire, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. That man, Joshua Graham, survived and became the legendary warrior known as the Burned Man. In the grand scheme of things, the NCR had won the dam, but the war was far from over. 2277, Project Purity and the Second Enclave defeat. In the capital wasteland, a scientist named James had spent years trying to finish what he and his late wife Catherine had started, Project Purity, a water purifier built inside the Jefferson Memorial. It was capable of cleaning the entire tidal basin and providing millions of gallons of drinkable water to the wasteland, freely to anyone who needed it. It was, as projects go, almost offensively idealistic, but it was also functional. In 2277, James finally made progress on getting the purifier online, working alongside Dr. Madison Lee and backed by Elder Owen Lyons' rogue Capital Wasteland Brotherhood chapter. However, that was when the Enclave made themselves known in the region. Colonel Augustus Autumn arrived with the strike team and demanded control of the project. James, realizing that Autumn wouldn't really let them leave alive, decided to sacrifice himself and flood the control chamber they were in with lethal radiation rather than give it up to the Enclave. Unfortunately, Autumn managed to inject himself with an anti-radiation substance right before the room was shot with radiation, allowing him to survive the process. The Enclave then seized Project Purity and mobilized across the capital wasteland in force, the most powerful display of organized military strength the region had seen since before the bombs. The Brotherhood, already considered a rogue chapter by Lost Hills leadership, committed everything they had. Their ultimate counter was Liberty Prime, a pre-war military robot the size of a building, which marched on the Jefferson Memorial and scattered the Enclave's lines. The lone wanderer, James's child, activated the purifier. Clean water began flowing into the wasteland for the first time since 2077. Eventually, the Enclave's East Coast operation was destroyed, Raven Rock was demolished, Adams Air Force Base fell, and the organization that had rebuilt itself after the oil rig's destruction was dismantled for the second time in 35 years, this time without any obvious base left to retreat to. In the end, the Brotherhood controlled the purifier and allowed the wasteland to have clean water. But somewhere, the Enclave was quietly reassembling itself once more. 2281. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam. It took about 4 years after the Legion's defeat in Hoover Dam before they returned. Caesar had spent those years rebuilding, and now, 87 tribes marched under his banner, ready to do his brutal bidding. At the tip of the Legion's spear is Legate Lanius, a warrior with a brutal reputation who replaced the disgraced Joshua Graham. Meanwhile, the NCR had spent those years spread thin, fighting the Brotherhood of Steel, managing an increasingly restless annexation of Nevada, and bleeding soldiers and money at a rate that was unsustainable. At the center of all of this was New Vegas, the city that Robert House had saved from the bombs by reprogramming 68 of the 77 nuclear warheads launched at it, and which he had ruled ever since from inside the Lucky 38 casino through a network of Securitron robots. House wanted neither the NCR nor the Legion controlling the city. The NCR wanted the Strip's tax revenue and called New Vegas's independence a fiction. However, Caesar wanted it as his Rome, and so the Second Battle of Hoover Dam was inevitable, and it was the moment everything came to a head. A courier, shot in the head and left for dead at the start of the story, and deeply inconvenienced by the whole experience, became the deciding factor of this massive conflict. Depending on which side they supported, the outcome of the battle changed. NCR victory, Legion conquest, Mr. House taking full control of New Vegas, or an independent Vegas free of all of them. What didn't change was the scale of the battle, the casualties on both sides, and the fact that after the smoke cleared, the Mojave Wasteland had a new dominant power, and whoever that was would define the region for generations. 2283, the fall of Shady Sands. The NCR's capital was Shady Sands, and by 2283, it had nearly 35,000 people living in it. It had a Hall of Congress, a fully functioning police force, parks, and a sewage system. It was, by any post-war standard, a city, the largest known urban center, built entirely from scratch after the bombs. But all of that progress was destroyed in one afternoon. The man responsible was Hank McLean, a Vault Tech executive who had been frozen in Vault 31 and periodically thawed to act as overseer of the adjacent Vault 33. McLean was also, as the TV series reveals, connected to the Enclave. His motivations were part institutional, part personal. Vault-Tech's mandate demanded the elimination of all competing factions so the world could be rebuilt according to their specific design. McLean also had a personal score to settle. His wife Rose had escaped the vaults, found her way to Shady Sands, and refused to come back. And so a nuclear warhead was covertly delivered into the city, and while there was an attempt to disarm it, it failed, and so the timer ran out. In one moment, the NCR's government, the executive, the legislative, the institutional memory of 2 centuries of democratic republic building was wiped out. Survivors scattered. Lee Moldaver, a pre-war scientist who had managed to live through the intervening years, gathered NCR remnants at the Griffith Observatory and kept the resistance alive. But the NCR as a functioning nation was finished. Everything Shady Sands had represented, the possibility that the wasteland could be rebuilt into something worth having, went up with it. 2287. The Battle for the Commonwealth. For decades, the Commonwealth in what used to be Massachusetts had been trapped in a shadow war it barely understood. It was a war fought by 4 factions with very different goals. The Institute was the invisible hand behind it all. They had been operating beneath the Commonwealth since 2110, abducting residents, releasing FEV-mutated super mutants as a proxy conflict, assassinating political organizers, and replacing people with synthetic copies. But fighting them from the dark was the Railroad, a secretive network dedicated to freeing escaped synths. And then there were the Commonwealth Minutemen, the only group actually trying to protect the people. They were a citizen militia built to help on a minute's notice, but by this point, they were on the verge of extinction thanks to the Quincy Massacre. Then, in 2287, the Brotherhood of Steel arrived from the Capital Wasteland on the Prydwen, a massive military airship with Elder Arthur Maxson in command. Their objective was the destruction of the Institute, which they deemed an existential threat to humanity. What followed was a 4-way war between the Brotherhood, the Institute, the Railroad, and a potentially resurging Minutemen, all fighting over the future of the Commonwealth. With synthetic humans at the center of the question, the war ended with the Institute's nuclear reactor detonating in its underground facility, destroying it completely. Which faction delivered the killing blow, and what kind of Commonwealth they built afterward, depended entirely on choices made by the sole survivor, a resident of Vault 111 who had been frozen in cryogenic suspension since before the Great War and woke up 210 years later into the middle of it all. 2296, Cold Fusion Breakthrough. Before the Great War, a scientist named Lee Moldaver, then going by Kate Williams, had come within reach of something that could have changed everything: cold fusion. This was near limitless energy generation at room temperature, with no need for oil, uranium, or the resources that had set the world on fire, but she never got to publish it. Vault-Tech, whose entire business model depended on the world remaining unstable enough to justify the vaults, bought every company she worked for and buried the technology. Cold fusion became proprietary, locked away inside Vault-Tech's infrastructure, used to power their Garden of Eden creation kits, and suppressed from the rest of the world. However, Moldaver survived the Great War through means not fully explained. By 2296, now well over 2 centuries old, she was still working towards the same goal. She made contact with an Enclave scientist named Siggy Wildzig, who had the cold fusion diode, the key component, implanted behind his ear before defecting. While being hunted, Wildzig realized that the only way out to transport the diode and prevent it from getting into the wrong hands was to unalive himself and let Lucy McLean hold on to his chip-infused head. Eventually, it reached Moldaver at the Griffith Observatory, allowing her to activate the cold fusion and lighting up Los Angeles for the first time in more than 2 centuries. However, the Knights of San Fernando, a Western Brotherhood of Steel chapter, stormed the observatory, wiped out the NCR remnants defending it, and seized the technology. Moldaver was killed in the battle. The cold fusion reactor was taken to Area 51, where it immediately became the subject of an internal Brotherhood power struggle. The diode itself changed hands again, ending up with Maximus, who handed it to the Ghoul, who used it to reactivate Robert House's digitized consciousness inside the Lucky 38. Cold fusion had finally arrived in the post-war world. What it was going to do there was still very much being decided. 2296. The Re-emergence of the Enclave. The Enclave was supposed to be finished. It had suffered major defeats twice before, first at the hands of the Chosen One in Fallout 2, when the oil rig was destroyed, and again in Fallout 3, when the Lone Wanderer dismantled their operations at Adams Air Force Base. By now, the organization should have been completely obliterated with no chance of coming back. But the events of the Fallout TV series, specifically at the end of Season 2, suggests something different. The Enclave is still operational. It has multiple active members working across different organizations, including, as revealed, Hank McLean, who simultaneously served as a Vault-Tech executive and an Enclave operative. The scope of how deeply embedded the Enclave remains within the post-war power structure is only beginning to become clear, and the organization's core objective hasn't changed: a violent reclamation of the surface world on terms set entirely by them. The exact shape of what the Enclave is now, how large, how coordinated, how capable, isn't fully known. But the ending of Season 2 makes one thing explicit: they are still there, they are not done, and the Wasteland has not seen the last of them. And that's every major event in Fallout explained. If you're still alive after all that, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Fallout lore dives.